Grahamstown in South Africa's Eastern Cape was established by the British as a base camp to irritate the Xhosa nation in the early 19th century. The City of Saints has over 40 religious buildings and churches, is the seat of the Regional High Court and home to Rhodes University. The town annually hosts the largest, longest-running arts festival in Africa. This year, the subject of cannabis was on the official programme, discussing the social implications of legalising Dagga in South Africa.
We really wanted to do this conversation, so some searching led us to other people who are interested and involved in the topic, so that we could have the conversation not just about the legal aspects, which is what we did yesterday, but to think about the kind of social and medical aspects of it and the impacts it would have on our society if we decided, if your court case is successful and we suddenly find ourselves in a brave new world. Okay, so Celia Jamieson is a physician, and I think, Celia, you work with rehabilitation and palliative care and people suffering terminal...
Care is terminal.
Yes, people suffering terminal illnesses. Okay. Paul Michael is representing the Dagga couple who are here. 1, 2, these are the two brave people taking on the state of the state of everything, okay? And then, sorry, now I've been working on getting your name in my head and now it's just gone in this embarrassing, Scott Wood. Scott Wood is a senior clinical psychologist working with the province, the Eastern Cape province, and has worked at Fort England. So I'm going to hand over to the panel. I'm not sure who would like to start or how would how you feel we should handle it. Celia, do you want to start?
I'll start because I'm
sure. Let me bring your microphone closer.
I've done a lot of research and reading and a lot of thinking about this, and I've got wavered backwards and forwards. But anyway, to talk about my perspective, I work in the field of palliative care, and my perspective is from that of using Dagga in palliative care. So palliative care is the care of people who are terminally ill or have a life-threatening disease. So we expect that they're not going to be around for many years. And the significance of this in the field of Dagga means that we can ignore to a certain extent the consequences of using the medication. Whereas in fact other people, where you're dealing with children, pregnant women, adolescents and young adults, you would have to take this into account very much more seriously. Just to get into a few details, the Dagga contains various psychoactive components. The most active is tetrahydrocannabinol, and this attaches to the CNS receptors, which are the CB1 and the CB2. CB1 is in the brain, and that's where you have the psychoactive effects, and CB2 is on the B cells, lymphocytes, and natural killer cells. And the importance about this is that it has been said that Dagga may have a role in anti-cancer treatment, and in fact this knowledge about the CB2 receptors would tend to support this. Unfortunately, of course, until we get to a point where we can research it properly, we're not going to be able to see that. So the effect of the cannabis can be seen in the control of pain, nausea, appetite, anxiety, poor sleep, and its possible role as an anti-cancer agent. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, there's fairly limited research in the use of Dagga as a medical agent because of the severe penalties imposed in many places. But it is somewhat interesting that medical use has been legalized in many parts of the world, so that we can assume that the research is going to be ongoing and will make decisions about using it much easier when we can back it up with research. And it is very surprising that South Africa, with such advanced medical care and such good palliative care, has not actually embraced the use of Dagga or the research into it. I think one probably should differentiate between cannabis oil, cannabinoids, and Dagga, which is the extract from the plant. So I'm using them synonymously, I'm not differentiating them. So in palliative care, which is the management of people with terminal illness, it's a very distressing time in people's lives. And the things that really worry people in the terminal phases of life are the fear of pain, nausea, anxiety, and the recognition of loss, so that people have lost everything. They've lost their normal body habitus, they've lost their lives, they've very often lost their future, they may have lost their relationships, and all of those things make people extremely anxious. And one of the things that they need to do is they need to recognize that in palliative care, what we're interested in is improving the quality of life rather than the duration of life. And we did actually find, surprisingly, that when we had patients admitted for palliative care, the duration of life would lengthen instead of shorten when you gave good palliative care, although we were using a lot of morphine. So in our management of pain, we use what's called the opioid ladder. So we start with the lowest and weakest painkillers, then we move on to the weak opioids, then we go on to the strong opioids. And the strongest opioid we have is morphine. The trouble with morphine, it's highly successful. It's also very dangerous, and it has a lot of side effects. And in about 10% of the population, those side effects are intractable, and particularly nausea. In some people, you can never control the nausea, no matter what you do. Confusion and hallucinations, and surprisingly enough, intractable itching. So there is a certain group of patients, I suppose about 10% of patients who are terminally ill, in whom we cannot use morphine because of these side effects. And it becomes very difficult to find an alternative. So the medical effects have been known for thousands of years, and Hazel outlines them very well in her book. And although I'm not getting a cut, I have to recommend it because it really is an excellent book with a lot of interest. And she mentions how Dagga has been used for pain, as an antibiotic, in anthrax, dysentery, snake bite, malaria, black water fever, asthma, chest problems, and mfufanyana, which the people who come from the Eastern Cape will know more about. It's a kind of psychological condition. And then more of great interest in the field of multiple sclerosis. So when we're dealing with terminal illness and we're looking at managing the nausea, we do have alternatives, and that's what people will say when they come to the court case. They'll say, why use Dagga? Because you can use Culcha. The problem with Culcha, it's 1,000 rand for 10 tablets, and I'm pretty sure you can buy a hell of a lot. The only problem with it is that you do often have to combine medications. So you have to give something for pain, something else for nausea. So you're actually increasing the amount of medication. But it can be highly successful. But there is a downside. And so what is the downside? This is a very controversial field. And because, in fact, the proponents, as the other panelists have mentioned, have been divided into two camps. They're absolutely pro, who go further and further over towards pro, and they're absolutely negative, who go further and further negative, and largely related to anxiety from the fact that they may be able to find themselves in handcuffs, sharing the cell next to Oscar. So we do have to recognise that in certain people, Dagga or the cannabinoids as a group can be associated with serious problems. So the receptor that's targeted is needed in brain cognition. And what we have discovered is that in fact there's a negative correlation between the use of Dagga and prefrontal activity and behavioral efficiency. And this has been written up in an article in Cortex this year. In the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, I'll cover it lightly, but I'm sure you'll give much more detail. There's a report that cannabinoids are associated with very modest benefits only in chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting, inconsistent effects on pain and spasticity, and this would be in your multiple sclerosis, inconclusive benefits for other conditions such as appetite, weight, sleep, mood, etc. However, cannabinoids will definitely increase adverse events, serious adverse events, and drop out due to serious events. And what it does is, because it's damaging the brain and you're getting a reduction in brain volume, you are seeing that cognition is impaired, which can be permanent and for a long period of time. And it's specifically that noted that in fact if people go driving after cannabis use, there's a very increased risk of fatal accidents. It's also been associated with dependence, respiratory conditions, psychosis, and possibly cancer on the other side. I think that's mainly lung cancer in combination with cigarette smoke. The other big source of anxiety is that if it's used in pregnancy, it affects fetal growth. In adolescence, it can affect neurodevelopment and social adjustment and make it more difficult for people to actually achieve their goals. And the higher the psychogenic content, and I believe that the stuff that comes from the Transkei is pretty good stuff, and it's much stronger than that from other parts of the world. So the higher the psychogenic concept, the more likely that there will be problems. In the journal Psychiatry Research, cannabis has been associated with subcortical brain volume reduction, psychosis, and then with ongoing use, there's an increase in relapse. And psychosis develops 2 to 3 years earlier in people that are susceptible. So it suggests that if you're carrying the gene around for schizophrenia, and you get involved with Dagga use, you will definitely get your schizophrenia earlier. Possibly you would never have got it. And this association with long-term medical problems is not associated with the use of alcohol and other substance abuse agents. The problem with the schizophrenia, unlike other forms of psychosis, may of course become a chronic condition. And the research that was done in this covered a fairly substantial number of people, and they were looking at over 500 people, so it wasn't a small drop in the ocean. So in conclusion, having thought about it for a very long period of time, my feeling about the whole thing is that we don't know enough about it. We may be missing the opportunity to use an agent which could be enormously helpful to us. And my feeling is that probably what we should be considering is to make it a scheduled drug, a Schedule 6 drug, like morphine, so that it can be very tightly controlled, and that we should promulgate the use of it in older people with terminal illness rather than younger people. And it seems somewhat ironic that the world is so anxious about morphine, which we know so much about, and we know it's toxic, but we know how to control the toxicity. And so many people are so keen to use Dagga without knowing very much about it. And I think that if we could open the door to research by either decriminalising it or legalising it, I think we could go much further ahead in terminal illness. Thank you.
My name is Lungisa Fiani. I'm a Rastafarian. My Rastafarian name is Hakim. I hope you all remember that. I'm actually a substitute of a substitute. I was actually informed yesterday to come and speak here. So I just got something brief, so I hope you can understand. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hello. Am I on? All right, I just want to introduce myself properly first. I'm a senior psychologist. I've been 20 years doing this job, and the last 10 years have been spent partly running a rehab. I've been involved indirectly in addiction for the last 20, but directly for about 12 years. My job this morning, is to really represent psychiatry. And I've been asked to focus on a few particular areas. One is the whole gateway drug thought. The second is cannabis in adolescence. The third is cannabis in psychiatry, specifically psychosis, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, and suicide. And then thirdly, really, what are psychiatry's current thoughts on the legalisation of cannabis? I'm trained as a neuropsychologist in terms of a master's degree. You need to be able to do neuropsychological assessment, and I'm also trained in research. And I just, before we start talking, because I'm going to be tracking quite a bit of research, the problem with research is it's completely manipulated by people doing research in order to gain certain outcomes that they already wanted. And the problems that we have is trying to find research that's valid and reliable. And over the last 20 to 30 to 40 years, we've gone from sample size to effect size to joining studies to meta-analytic studies. And we're slowly getting better at degrees of confidence, but we're not there. And there are so many questions that we have. And as Celia said, the legalisation will allow us to do the research in order to get the answers. All right, so let me start. So, cannabis, the gateway drug. So, if you don't know this, Denise Kendall, 40 years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, was the person who termed the coin gateway drug, and it was tobacco. Okay. Now, I've been in a rehab, as I said, for 10 years. We probably had about 5,000 people through that system in 10 years. And I'm sucking thumb. 98% of them started smoking cigarettes first. So let's just start with that. Now, Denise's role was really, she wasn't interested in the legalities of the substance. She was just interested in which substance we started with first. But if you do start looking at legal versus illegal, illicit versus illicit, cannabis in general, 80% of the time, seems to be the first one. Well, the question is why? And the current thoughts about that is, you have this vulnerable person, who, somebody who's vulnerable to substance use, I'm not going to go into that, who's going through some difficult time, needing some assistance. What are you going to use first? You're going to use something that you view as safe. You're going to use, or safer, you're going to use something that's socially acceptable. You're going to use something that's easily accessible. And in general, I said tobacco being the first, usually from your parents or your friends. And recently moving on to cannabis. The whole idea that because you smoke cannabis, you will then move on to the next as a direct result of cannabis itself, that's not a sound thought. It's more the thought that if you are a susceptible person and you start using cannabis, it could be, not always, a movement towards somewhere else. The question is why? The holy grail of narcotics would be to find a drug that your body doesn't get used to. Because you would always then be able to take the same amount of drug every day, have the same effect for the same period of time. And yet even cannabis doesn't meet this mark. And so the problem with cannabis in general, in terms of the rehab that we're working in, is people start off using on an infrequent basis and gaining the full effects. And slowly but surely, because it's enjoyable, they start using more and more, and the unfortunate effect of that is tolerance starts building. The opposite side of the coin of tolerance is withdrawal, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. Sorry, I know my job, I guess, is to be quite specific, and so I need to make sure that I get through this in about 5 to 10 minutes. Regarding the overall safeness of cannabis, if you have a look at a Lancet, a 2010 Lancet publication, in terms of the 10 most dangerous drugs, either due to direct or indirect mental health, physical health influences, or levels of dependence. Cannabis comes 8, tobacco comes 6, heroin comes 2nd, alcohol comes 1st. So once again, it's not safe, it does sit on an 8. And that needs to be brought into consideration. As I said, to have a polarized view on this is just unhealthy. Cannabis in adolescence. Oh, sorry. So in a nutshell, cannabis does not lead to the rest because of cannabis directly itself, but it is a stepping stone for vulnerable others. Okay. And just this is more of an observation over the last 10 years. Cannabis, to increase cannabis, to cannabis man racks, and sorry, I'm speaking to the population size that the populations that we deal with, and then slowly moving on to more severe forms of narcotics. Okay, methamphetamine, TIC is really changing the field and possibly being a first or second point of introduction, but usually moving up a scale. Adolescence. coming back to neuropsychology background, our brain, we go to school in the year that we turn 7 because that is the first time that we can understand that an apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It's the year in which our abstract thought kicks in. And our brain continues to develop over time until early adulthood. And the last areas to develop are your frontal lobes. And your frontal lobes are your executive functioning. Now, cannabis interferes with the endocannabinoid system in the brain. Why is that important? It's important because the endocannabinoid system is involved in general brain development. And the too early introduction of cannabis neurologically influences the development, especially frontal lobes. Now, what research is noticing is essentially 2 areas. The one is generalized problems with neurological development, whether we're talking about structure, connections, and so on. And the one thought is, as a result of difficulties or neurological problems, the brain needs to work harder to get the job done. As a result, fatigue sets in earlier than the control group. And as a result, your memory and concentration start to fall when compared to the control group. But more specifically for adolescents, if your frontal lobes are going to be developing last, when does psychiatry say would be healthy if you were going to start using cannabis? When would a healthy place be? Essentially, they're saying as long as possible. If you're trying to press them, they'll talk around about 20 to 21. In terms of deficits, essentially, what do the frontal lobes do? Essentially, you're going to have deficits in information processing, reward processing, motivation, self-awareness, decision-making, general higher order functioning things. An interesting thing, and obviously the whole motivational syndrome thing, your frontal lobe is highly involved in your drive, your connection, your energy, and that kind of thing. And the sense is that not only does cannabis influence the development of your frontal lobes, but while you are using cannabis, it is I'm sure about a mild to moderate influencer on your frontal lobe's ability to do what it's supposed to do, and hence the idea of an amotivational syndrome. Am I making sense so far? Okay. In general, IQ deficits starting in adolescence, poorer academic performance, increased risk for an aggressive form of testicular cancer, and the increased risk for later addiction. I'm going to talk a little bit about psychosis in a second. Not everybody who uses substances becomes an addict. That's the bottom line. And if you're looking at what seems to be reliable research, we're talking about 1 in 6. 1 in 6 cannabis users need it more than the average person in order to live a life that they feel is comfortable for them. And then the problem, as I said, with tolerance and so on, the need for increased use. Now, it's kind of like stealing 5 cents out your mother's purse. You know you shouldn't. It's terrible to do it the first time because thou shalt not steal. The only way that you can steal the first time is to tell yourself, I'm only going to do it once. And then you do it. The second time you steal is worse than the first. Because you know that you're breaking a rule that you set. You're breaking life's rule, and you're breaking the contract that you had with yourself the first time about, I'm only going to do it once. You continue to steal 5 cents out your mother's purse. It becomes 10 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents. We become desensitized. If I'm an addict, that's 6%. If I'm an addict, I lose the ability over time to tell myself, no. I get used to it. I get used to what I do, I get used to the current lifestyles, and as the problems start developing, and once again, not all people develop psychiatric complications, but as the problems start developing, if I was honest, I'd turn around to myself and say, there's a problem developing here. Is this due to my substance use? If it is, I need to start doing some talking to myself in terms of either decreasing frequency or whatever the case may be. If I don't, I'm going to continue to use. And essentially, the more that I use and the higher the toxicity of that I'm using, and if it's going to be creating psychiatric complications, you can just see where that's going to go. Cannabis and psychiatry. And I'm going to start off with psychosis. I think the term the vulnerable minority is an important term here. We're not talking about the majority. You know, if we're doing an assessment of a client or patient coming into the hospital, family history is an important thing. Because if something happened to your family, there's a greater likelihood that it's going to happen to you. Whether it's a substance-induced psychosis, whether it's a major depressive disorder, whether it's a substance use disorder. Irrespective of the reasons therefore, whether it's genetic reasons, and there's not a hell of a lot of sound research on that, but there's a lot of social, cultural, monkey see, monkey do related research on things like this. Now, essentially what psychiatry is saying is, we have this vulnerable minority who are unaware that they are a vulnerable minority, and when they use cannabis over an extended period of time, it creates issues for them, that sample. We're kind of lucky that we're starting to get genetic research coming through. The problem is we seem to have exhausted all avenues in getting information using the research that we have, and so a lot of the money is going to start going into developing technology to do the kinds of research that we currently can't do. But we're starting to get gene research coming through, and they're starting to identify what they believe are the root causes for that vulnerable minority. And if you are part of the vulnerable minority, you're talking about things like a 7 times increased risk for psychosis. You're talking, in terms of the 2007 Lancet, they did a systematic review on 35 studies. And the bottom line is, there is strong evidence. We talk about strong evidence, weak evidence, no evidence at all. There is strong evidence that within the vulnerable minority, there is an increased risk for psychosis in various forms. Now, what we see, the problem with, there's something else about cannabis, makes it kind of unique. You ingest a substance other than cannabis, within 72 hours, give or take, you're going to have excreted it. It's the last place you're going to find a substance is in your urine, and you get it out your system. Cannabis is unique, it sits in your fat. And so you will continue to test positive. Old research was talking about 36 days. Now they're starting to use more sensitive testing kits and finding out to 46 days. So the problem is, what happens if you are the vulnerable minority and you become psychotic as a result of cannabis? You will remain in that psychotic state for an extended period of time, as opposed to other substances which usually resolve within 72 hours, which is why we have in our hospital system 72-hour wards in order to filter out all the other substance-induced psychoses. The problem with cannabis is, if you're the vulnerable minority, it's going to last longer. You're going to be discharged from Settlers Hospital, you're going to be transferred through to us, and it's going to continue. Now the problem is that in terms of psychosis, there's psychosis, but then there are patterns of psychosis that become diagnoses. And you've got a brief psychotic disorder, which is essentially psychosis for a month, but not caused by a general medical condition or by a substance. And then you've got psychosis that lasts for a month to up to 6 months, and they call it a schizophrenic form. And then schizophrenia essentially is more than 6 months. So the problem with cannabis is, we've got people coming into the system who are sometimes dishonest, but essentially in terms of their cannabis use, and then we're doing drug screening and finding out that they've got a urine positive, and they're psychotic for more than 30 days. The question that we have is, do we have an evolving schizophreniform disorder which increases the chance that they are actually a schizophrenic patient in the long term? Or is this just a substance-induced psychosis, cannabis, that all we need to do is just settle them, and once they're discharged, they will decrease treatment, and then they will go off treatment-free? So it creates a bit of a dilemma for us. Secondly, THC, cannabis, it influences the course of the illness for various reasons, starting with basic concrete stuff. Compliance to medication regimes. We're having problems with substance users in general, with cannabis users specifically for this talk, where they're not taking the medications required in order to remain well. In other words, I'm not saying that it's a direct consequence of the cannabis use, but just because they're using cannabis, they're not being responsible with the other things that they should be using. But then, in terms of direct, we're noticing, for example, in mania with psychotic features or pure psychotic features, that somebody will settle, we will start sending them out on a weekend leave because you want to test and so on first and get collateral. They're then using cannabis over the weekend and they're coming back floridly psychotic, which is a problem because they've gone from a lock-up ward to an open ward, gone home, come back, too psychotic to be in an open ward, back to a lock-up ward, cannabis settles, 36 days, back to an open ward, back out. And so we sit with this revolving door process. Once again, just to highlight, we're talking about the vulnerable minority here. Once again, an all or nothing discussion on this is unhelpful.
Scott, would you
1 minute.
sort of draw to a conclusion?
Yeah. Depression and anxiety and suicide, there is no evidence that provides strong confidence that there is a link at present. And then lastly, future management. The Guardian, a British newspaper, June, essentially there are two leading public health, mental health organizations. They are the Royal Society for Public Health and the Faculty of Public Health, are basically both saying decriminalize all substances. Why? Not because they're healthy, not because they're no risk, but because the threat of incarceration and actual incarceration are just not stemming the tide. And you can't flog a dead donkey. Now, once again, that is a clinical point of view. That point of view is shared by myself, and it is shared generally by all the colleagues that I work with. Thanks.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to have to take this from a slightly different perspective. I had a chat after yesterday's presentation to a member of the audience who pointed out to me that one of my generalizations in my slides yesterday as to the addictive nature of cannabis was technically not correct. And what I said to him is I had to speak in general. It was a very brief talk on the legal challenge next year. Now, the first thing to say is that this legal challenge that the Dagga couple are bringing in August next year is a trial action. We have set it down with the courts to run over the course of 20 days. That's one hell of a long time to run a trial, and the reason for this is that we are flying out international experts on this subject, neuropsychopharmacologists, etc., who can come and talk to all of these things that we are discussing today. And we talk of a middle ground that needs to be reached. This is a very polarized debate. All of the advocates for it say that it cures every ailment under the sun, and everybody who's against it calls it the devil cabbage, and it's going to result in the sky falling on our heads. The reason that we're getting these experts out is that they can be thoroughly interrogated under cross-examination by the state, and we can get an acceptable middle ground that the court accepts as the harm and benefit that can be associated with cannabis usage. So it's not for me to tell you whether it's good or bad, it's for this to be determined by way of evidence next year in court. That stated, we come from a human rights perspective next year. The real crux of that is that our Constitution, a fantastic document, requires us, in terms of Section 9.1, which is an equality provision, to be rational and consistent in our lawmaking and in the application of our laws. So what it says is that if you have two analogous cases, you need to treat these cases as alike. You cannot be putting one person into prison and not putting another person into prison when they are doing the exact same thing. We then have to look at what we can compare in order to reach this kind of thing. And I think what would be shared by all of the panelists at this table is that we know for certain that society allows us to use certain substances and engage in certain activities that are harmful to us. So even if it is established that there are certain risks associated with cannabis use, the question that we then need to ask ourselves, while we are celebrating in some instances the use of alcohol at a rugby game, at a 21st, whatever it is, and some people would even encourage each other to smoke hubbly bubbly at a social event, These things are terrible for us. The rugby itself is terrible for us. We do not go to prison for engaging in a rugby game. It is celebrated. So this is a human rights issue, especially, and it was quite interesting because the concluding statement of my co-panelist was that it is a clinical perspective that this criminalizing it doesn't stem the tide. It's not only a clinical perspective, it's very much a legal perspective, because our Constitution, Section 36, also requires us to assess these kinds of things. Are the means that you are taking to achieve a purpose, and in this case the purpose is obviously to reduce the harms associated with something, are the limitations on the rights of our citizens achieving these ends? And if it can be shown that criminal prosecution and putting people into jail is not in fact achieving the purpose of lessening the usage of this, you have no right as a state to be putting people into jail, because it is a fundamental infringement of your rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of our country. So wherever you find yourself in this debate, whether you are pro or against it, you need to be asking yourself the question whether you are comfortable with putting people in prison for this usage. Because I certainly think that everybody here would agree that the ultimate goal here is, if this is a medical problem and people are suffering, then we need to come up with a medical solution, not a criminal solution, not by putting people into jail. Let's take all of this money that we are spending on putting people into jail and prosecuting them and keeping them in jail. We're talking about hundreds of millions of rands. Let's take that money, let's put it into education. Let's let teens know that they are potentially making themselves stupid if they are making themselves stupid. Let us take that money, put it into rehabilitation centres and the very research that my co-panelists have said is lacking. There are huge resources spent. I think the Anti-Drug Alliance of South Africa put it at something like 245 million rand a year just in Gauteng. And this is just spent in arresting and prosecuting. This is not even the jail time that people are doing for this. Never mind that these people who go to prison are exposed to harder drugs, to hardened criminals. These are people that are sitting in the comfort of their lounge, smoking a joint, potentially harming themselves. We don't know. We'll establish that next year. But let's not send them to prison.
Greetings again. Basically, I'm just going to focus on the Rastafari community. I'm not going to touch on the other aspects because I find that my panelists have already touched upon it, especially the human rights part. Basically, just wanted to explain basically how the Rastafari community take on this issue of decriminalizing Dagga. We believe that decriminalizing Dagga is the first step. We should completely and totally legalize the herb. That's what we term it sometimes. Basically, the reason being is because by decriminalizing ganja, you are automatically, by criminalizing Dagga, you are automatically criminalizing the Rasta people. If we all walk out here and do our daily things, pretty much I'm the one who's going to be a suspect on site, you know. Pretty much anybody who's walking past just call you, hey Rasta, have you got some? You know, that kind of thing, you know. Dagga is associated with the Rasta people, right? So now, by criminalizing the Dagga, you're actually criminalizing a whole community of people, you know. A community of people who are actually using the herb, you know, for recreational purposes, for spiritual purposes, you know, and for cultural purposes, you know. Because within our community of Rastafari, you know, the herb, we do not take it as a drug, you know, as the general society does, you know. So even these studies in psychiatry, we could even debate them too, because I mean, they're mostly based on Western studies, you know, and the West is what actually criminalized Dagga. If we look at the 1908 law which was put on ganja, on the sale of Dagga, we should look at the government who was responsible for that. And we should look at the kind of thinking that was behind that, you know. Basically, that was the early 20th century, right? Which was influenced by the later 19th century of the British, the British Empire, you know, colonizing the African nation, and coming there with this self-righteous attitude of saying we are here to civilize the uncivilized races, right? And they came there and we were already using the herb for so long, you know. I don't know how long the African people have been using the herb, and they haven't had these kind of problems of, you know, depression and all these problems that we're having today. I think that the problems that people are having today, we cannot like totally blame Dagga on that. There are so many other social issues that are in that, you understand? So now taking Dagga and actually saying it's responsible for that, you know, that I think that's very part of the same British colonial mentality that came to criminalize ganja itself. I just wanted to explain the history behind Rastafari and ganja. I'll just be brief on that. There's a man called Leonard Howell who was the first Rasta. We call him Gong Guru Maharaj. If you know about the Jamaican history, we know that in Jamaica, the British took over from the Spanish. So when the British took over from the Spanish, they brought over the Indian slaves, indentured slaves, who actually, coming from India, brought the herb with them, ganja or kali or whatever you want to call it. Through bringing that, the Africans, which were the slaves to the plantations, you know, they actually used the herb because if you understand how the Indian people use the herb, it's very deeply spiritual and cultural. You know, there's even a god for cannabis in India. They call him Shiva. You understand? So the Rastafari began now as a social response to colonialism and slavery. You know, through the British oppression on the people of Africa, the people they looked to the Indian people who are using ganja as a cash crop. So for them, for this man specifically, Leonard Howell, he used ganja as a cash crop, you know, to build the economy of this community of the Rasta people, because he built the first commune of the first society of Rasta people in Jamaica, where they used ganja as a cash crop. Now, at the time that they were using ganja as a cash crop, they did not need anything from the central sphere of life where it was ruled by the British colonists. They lived in mountains where they grew their own food. You know, they wore their own clothes where they've made from natural trees. You know, and what you call. So what I'm trying to say is that as the Rastafari people, we use ganja in our daily lives. You know, not just for puffing. You know, we use all the other benefits of ganja, you know, where it can be used industrially, you know. That aspect of it can benefit our community of Rasta people, because if you look at the Rasta people, we are a minority in South Africa, and most of us are unemployed. Why we're unemployed is because we adhere to the principles and philosophies of Marcus Garvey, who teaches us self-reliance. Not to rely on the system, you know, because the system is oppressive. We all know that, you know, but we're all going to deny that, you know. So the Rasta people in South Africa are facing this issue of facing persecution and prosecution every day. Right now, as we're sitting, probably 10 Rastafari or 100 Rastafari all over the country are being arrested, you know. And there's no one specifically looking at that, you know, that these people are not criminal people, but are people like everybody else. But the way that they are looked at is based upon the fact of the colonial mentality, you know, which was imposed upon them by colonialism, you know. So if we could decolonize ourselves first, you understand, then we would see ganja in another light or in another perspective, you know. So as the community here today, I would like for us to open our minds, you know, to this struggle that the Rasta people are facing, you know. We need each other as people in society. So we also need you here, you know, because the people out there, the authorities, they don't care. They're just serving their agenda, you understand? So the people, you know, as the Constitution says, the people are the people who govern, you know. So it is through the support of the people, you know, that the Rasta people can be seen in a different light, you know, can be seen as positive and productive people in society. We need to remove all the stigmas attached to marijuana, you know, that ganja people are lazy, you know, ganja people are crazy, mad people, you know. Some of us are educated, you know. We are lawyers. I'm a mechanical engineering student, you know, and I'm very ambitious, you know, in designing and doing all kinds of things. I'm wanting to work in the energy, you know, producing natural energy. We know that cannabis, you can also use cannabis for energy, you know, and we can stop cutting down trees, you know, such things, you know. We can work together in that, you know, to help our environment, to help our society, you know. There's so many people who are being put in jail, who are sent to mental asylums, and these people are innocent people, you know, but based on these orthodox, you know, based on policies and these orthodox studies that have been taken from the West and from the time of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and all of that, you know, those were very limited studies to actually try and actually diagnose people of today with the same studies, you understand? So I believe as a community here together, we can help fight the scourge, you know. You know, we can work together, you know, because the Rastafari people are also positive people, they're also productive people in society, you know. Okay, give that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.